evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us today, Governor Nathan Deal. Welcome back to Mercer and Macon, Georgia.
Thank you.
Now, Governor, you've climbed many mountains in your day. You've had many adventures, but a lot of your journey through life started right here at Mercer. I mean,
Yes.
How did you decide to come here, and do you have any comments about what that meant to you in your career, your stay
Well,
here?
thank you for the question. As you may know, I spoke to the students over at Mercer today and the faculty that were there, and it was Founders Day celebration. And I will repeat some of the things I said to them about my introduction to Mercer. I had looked it up in order to prepare for that presentation and realized that today it's about 61 and a half years ago that I first came to Mercer, and I was on the Willingham Auditorium stage at that point in time. I had just graduated from high school. I was 17 years old. I was there and as a participant. Actually, I won the competition of the Young People Speaking Competition of the Georgia Baptist Association's training program. I was fortunate in that regard, but it was my first visit to Mercer. Now, I grew up in Sandersville, which is only about 60 miles away, but I had never visited Mercer before that time. And as I told them, it was a pivotal event in my life because I had previously intended to go to the University of Georgia and study to be a veterinarian. I grew up showing livestock, and my father was a vocational agriculture teacher, and we were up on a farm there in middle Georgia. And then suddenly things began to happen that pointed me in a different direction. And so when I came to Mercer on that occasion and saw the campus, it was beautiful, it was compact, much more compact than it is, I might say, today.
Yes.
But it was an eye-opening experience for me, and I decided, well, I believe I might like to come here. So some 3 months after that first appearance on that program on the stage there, I was a freshman at Mercer at that point in time. So, and from there on, it became a story of the direction my life took. I was a 3-3 program individual on undergraduate and law school, so I graduated from both undergraduate and law school in 6 years. I got in the ROTC program. The very first thing I did was to sign up for ROTC when I got to Mercer. I went through that. I did very well with that. I was the cadet commander in my senior year, and I was commissioned after I got through law school. They allowed me to get a deferment to finish the last 2 years of law school because my fourth year, an undergraduate, was actually my first year of law school. So I got a commission. I was in the JAG Corps at that point in time and was then on active duty in the Army, and I rose to the rank of captain before I went back into civilian life.
Wow, well, that's quite a little journey. How did you find I guess, going from Sandersville to the big city of Macon, Georgia, with all these, I guess, there's a fair amount of frivolity around and sort of a different ambiance, or how did you adjust to that? I mean, you seem to have done well. Do you have any memories of any adventures that you'd like to discuss, or maybe not?
Well, I got busy. I mean, I
Yes.
decided when I got here, I didn't have the livestock to take care of or the farm chores anymore.
Yes.
I just decided I'd study.
Yes.
And that's what I put my mind to. I pledged to Alpha Tau Omega fraternity.
Yes.
And was initiated after that first quarter. In
Yes,
those days,
yes,
we were on
yes.
the quarter system.
Yes.
And I decided that, I can do this.
Yes.
This is a new world,
Yes.
different people.
Yes.
And I was an only child. So
Oh, really? Wow.
I said when I was initiated into the ATO fraternity, I
Yes.
suddenly had brothers,
Yes,
things I had
yes.
never had before.
Yes, yes.
And the closeness of those relationships have continued. And we, as a fraternity, we have the ones of my age group.
Yes.
We attend our reunions usually at least once a year, and we are constantly in touch with each other or by phone or by text messages to check on each other. We're getting of the age group now where we're checking on each other to figure out how their health is.
Yes, well, I mean, that's the story is maybe you talk about the girls when one age group, and then next maybe people talk about money, and finally they talk about their health. Is that the way the journey goes?
That's
a little
for sure.
bit?
We're in that latter
Right,
stage.
I am too. Lots of new things to talk about. Do you remember any particular professors that that you had an impact on you, or any particular courses that you?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you two segments of my speech today.
Yeah. Okay.
One of them, I was emphasizing the importance of having good professors.
Yes.
And saying that, good professors can give you a career path, and
Yes.
they can assist you and
Yes.
direct you in the right places. And I said, but they also can change your direction.
Yes.
And I cited to them my experience in Dr. Ware's biology class.
Oh, yes.
Where we were required to dissect frogs that were in a formaldehyde barrel. I said, whatever intentions I thought I had to want to be a doctor would dispel at that, because the smell of money to be a doctor was overcome by the smell of formaldehyde.
Well, just so.
In that
Just
frog
so. It's
barrel.
pretty unpleasant aroma. Both of them can have an unpleasant aroma sometimes.
That's right.
Sometimes.
But I decided to pursue a legal career and got my my diploma from, at that time, we called it the Walter F. George School of Law.
Yes.
And then from there to the military. After the military, I went back into private practice in Gainesville, Georgia.
Yes.
And we've lived in that area ever since.
Well, law is quite a challenging career. I mean, is there any part of it that appealed to you? Was it the courtroom experience, or maybe going through the legal documents of, finding little miscues somewhere? Was that any part of it you liked?
When I was here in law school, I worked part-time in order to have some money.
Yes.
And I worked for at that time it was called the Martin, Snow, Grant, and Napier law firm.
Yes, I'm familiar
Very
with that.
prominent
Yes,
law
yes,
firm
yes.
here in Macon. I was doing title examinations for
Yes.
them. And just as that experience can determine what your future might be, I suddenly decided, after lifting all of those big heavy books
Yes,
and checking
yes.
titles in the basement of a courthouse,
Yes.
I didn't want to be a real estate lawyer. I
So
knew
that you crossed that off the
I
list.
crossed that one off. But I did want to be a trial lawyer, and that's
Yes.
ultimately what I wound up doing. Got a great opportunity fairly early in my
Yes, yes.
career to be an assistant district attorney.
Yes.
And I think I tried every case but 3 in a
Yes.
4-county circuit up in the northeast Georgia area for a little over 2 years. That is great trial experience.
Yes.
And I learned a lot. I learned to be able to react quickly.
Yes, yes.
And be able to deal with my abilities in front of a jury. So
Yes, and I mean, that's quite a skill that's transferable, I think, to politics in many ways, and also just getting a knowledge or a sense of the human condition.
that's right.
Maybe it's not always so pleasant, is it, when people sort of get into conflict
true.
with each other? It's
Yeah.
maybe that gets you ready to deal with the state legislature.
That's right. Well, one thing it did was, because those jurors, they'll remember you.
Yes.
And when I started to run for public office, many
Yes.
of them would come up to me and say, "I remember when you prosecuted cases as a young
Yes,
attorney."
yes, yes.
So it stood me in good stead.
How did you make the decision to go into politics? Was that something? I mean, it's quite a difficult path. I mean, was it one that just you suddenly decided to do it? Did someone encourage you to do it?
Well, I have had a lot of encouragers, and I never really planned to be governor of this state.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
a lot of people say, "Oh, I've wanted to be governor since I
Yes,
was in grammar
yes,
school."
right.
That was never my aspiration. But I got into politics. My first elected office was to the Georgia State Senate.
Yes.
And that was in 1980 election cycle. I had been practicing law and been in
Yes.
the DA's office there
Yes.
in the Hall County area. And our long-serving state senator decided to retire.
Yes.
Friends started talking to me
Yes.
about,
Right. Yes.
you need to run for this. I did in the 1980 cycle and was elected and stayed there for 12 years.
Wow.
6 election cycles, rose through the ranks of the state senate, and was the president pro tem when I left, which is the highest position that your fellow senators can give you, right underneath the lieutenant governor's office.
How did you find the process of making laws? I mean, is that it's quite a sausage factory, so to speak. You don't want to know. Going into a sausage factory is not too pleasant, but
Yeah.
what comes out is okay. How
Well,
did you find that?
I liked it. I
did you?
liked it. And the reason I liked it was because, like you say, I had real world experience
Yes.
dealing with people.
Yes.
I have a lot of young people that come up and talk to me and they say, they want to get into politics. What
Yes.
would you recommend
Yes.
I do? My
Yes.
standard answer is get a job. And the reason is, when you make laws and regulations and things, you need to understand from a real world perspective what the effects of those are going to be on real people. And many people in politics and in the legislative branch in particular, some of them don't have that real world experience. And that's why you see laws having to come back and be repealed, amended, et cetera, because nobody thought about the what ifs
Yes.
down the road. I felt like that my experience had given me the opportunity to ask those questions in advance and craft legislation that was going to be appropriate and not have consequences that were unintended.
You know, we have these terrible centrifugal forces now in our country and in our world, and the political parties are at loggerheads with one another. How did you find that experience? Obviously, if you're the governor, you have to deal with all factions. But how did you find getting along with your political opponents? How did that work out? Would you learn something?
Well, politics is a rough sport,
Yes.
and you can't have thin skin
Yes.
because things are going to be said that'll hurt your feelings. And if you just simply quit, then
Yes.
you can't play the game. I was probably a little thin-skinned as I
Well,
began.
yes.
But I found that my wife's best advice is what she says: if you'll just be nice.
Yes. Well,
You'd be surprised.
let's take
Just-
this. Go ahead. Go
Just
ahead.
being nice
Yes.
to people that would normally be your opponents will disarm them. And I was very fortunate. Let me give you an example of what I mean and how that works out. One of the big programs I undertook was criminal justice reform, and we spread it out over a 7-year legislative period. And we started out by studying the issue.
Yes.
And by the way, one of our fellow trustees of Mercer University is now a justice on the Supreme Court,
Yes,
Justice
indeed.
Michael Boggs.
Yes.
And I asked him to head up this Criminal Justice Reform Council.
Yes.
And he did. He stayed as the head of it, shepherded the legislation
Yes.
through the General Assembly. All of it passed almost unanimously.
Yes.
Very few dissenting votes. And the reason was several reasons. One was we tried to be nice to everybody.
Yes.
We tried to take the time to explain to people why
Yes.
we were doing this and what the consequences were
Yes.
going to be that we foresaw. And the consequences turned out to be correct. They were good consequences. We saw the prison population drop
Yes.
by from about 56,000 down to about 48 now, I think.
Yes.
But what we did was, we did what one of our fellow Mercer alumni did,
Yes.
who was judge of the Superior Court here in Macon, and that was Judge Tommy Day Wilcox,
In my Sunday school class.
who was one of the premier people starting drug courts in our
Yes.
state.
Yes.
And we took some of his model and we expanded it, and we now have accountability courts in every circuit in the entire state of Georgia, and that's a real compliment. That took nonviolent offenders, most of whom had addictions,
Yes.
and kept them from having to go to a $20,000 a year prison bed,
Yes.
and it's kept them in a community setting where they were counseled, where they were held accountable for their own actions. And that had tremendous positive effects. In fact, one of the studies that was done by the Carl Vinson Institute found that those programs on an annual basis added about $38.3 million a year back into the state's economy. One, we didn't have to spend as much on incarceration cost. We didn't have to spend money on children of these people being put into foster care. And if they were still out in the community, they had to work. And when
Yes.
they had to work, they had to pay taxes.
Yes.
So it was a tremendous success and really has become the model for many other states around the country.
Well, there must be a list of things that you can take some pride in, and some you wish you'd done something differently. but I know there are a lot of, the list is long on good things you've done. But you know, you mentioned about your niceness persona, and this gives me a chance to ask you to discuss your wife's influence on your obviously. I mean, you're a team, and that's been my experience at least. The wife can really keep you straight and can take care of a lot of your defects, at least for me.
Absolutely.
But do you have any in your career? Any thoughts about that? Your wife's influence?
And I owe a lot to my wife, Sandra. I think she's probably one of the most loved first ladies
Yes.
Georgia has ever
Yes.
had. and I'm proud of her.
Yes.
She took up a project of reading because
Yes.
she was trained and educated to be
Yes.
an elementary school, middle school
Yes.
teacher.
Yes.
So she took up reading as an important
Yes.
thing that children need to have the skill set for that.
Absolutely.
And she would take up reading books to children, everything from preschool up through about the third grade. And in the course of her doing that, she physically read in over 1,000 individual classrooms. And she covered every circuit in the state, every school district in the
Yes.
state, and she covered every county in the state. She traveled a whole lot more than I did, and as she reminds me, she didn't get to ride in a helicopter or an airplane.
The trumpets didn't blow, exactly.
She had to
Yes,
drive, or
yes,
she had
yes,
someone
yes,
driving
yes,
her
yes,
to do that.
yes.
So, and she made a big difference, and people still come up to her and thank her for doing that, because one of the most essential skill sets that children have to have is the ability to read.
Well, how were you lucky enough to persuade her to be your wife? Is there a story there? I mean, you.
Well, yes, there is. She grew up in where we live now, in the
Yes.
Hall County area.
Yes.
But she came to school down at what was called then the Woman's College over in Milledgeville.
Yes.
It's now Georgia College and State University.
Yes.
And so she was only about 30 miles
Yes.
from here. But I met her on a blind date. One of my high school classmates who had gone to school with her at Milledgeville
Oh,
there,
yes.
Introduced us one summer. And
Yes.
so it led to good things.
And so she was able to straighten you out. Is that
She
right?
straightened me out. We've been married now for over 55
Well,
years.
good for you. Good for you. That's a wonderful story. And you know, I mean, just that's a life pattern is it's something that's hard to reduplicate. And maybe is that an issue with our country? I mean, how many life patterns are there like that? Is that
Well,
you have any thoughts about that?
You know, there are a lot of things that politicians can do and issues they can deal with, but one of the underlying things that keeps a society on course is to have strong family units. And I think we're seeing the deterioration in those units, those family
Yes.
units. We're seeing too many children born out of wedlock.
Yes.
We're having to see too many children raised by a single mother.
Yes.
And those generally do not turn out as well
Yes.
as if you are raised in a two-parent family. Now, that's not to say that there are not extremely good examples
Sure.
of children who've come out of those other situations. But I think everything we should do is try to encourage those family units. And it's tough. I mean, everybody who's been married knows that there are times when there are rough bumps in the road. But the stickability of it depends on the character of both of the parties to the marriage.
Yeah, a lot of this may have a religious relationship, I would say that.
Absolutely.
But, at least I won't go through the statistics, but one of the things that impresses me is the amount of children born out of wedlock in the United States, in the country, and then what happens to them after they enter those situations. Right. And all kinds of bad things happen. It really focusing a lot on trying to preserve the family unit is a huge task. Is it past political ability to do something? I don't think, can politicians do anything?
I don't know that politicians can do anything about it, but they can be sure they don't pass rules and laws that have the adverse effect on family units. One of those that was done many, many years ago, I suppose it was classified as a part of a welfare reform, was to say that a mother could not receive welfare benefits if there was a man living in the home with her.
Yes.
So it encouraged those single family, single parent units, and that
Yes.
was government policy. Now, I know what the purpose was.
Yes.
It was to say, you know, we want to get you off of welfare,
Yes.
and we don't want this situation to occur. But sometimes good purposes don't provide good results, and I think that may have been one of them.
In looking at the way the world goes, I mean, one thing I have wondered about is laws are passed, but then what really happens, the regulations are put in. Yeah. Some administrators or bureaucrats put these regulations in, and that's really what is impacting the world. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, you know, that's the thing I think a lot of people don't understand, is that many laws, in fact, I'd say most laws, are general in nature.
Yes.
And are intentionally left that way for the purpose of having the blanks filled in by administrative rules and regulations.
Yes.
And sometimes what happens is those rules and regulations produce an effect that is the opposite of what the original legislation was intended to do. And then the legislative body has to come back in and amend the original legislation to, in effect, do away with all of these implementing rules and regulations that have produced contrary of effects after the fact. So I think that is one of the real areas that we need to all take a close look at. Now, that's not to say that we all try to micromanage everything, because we don't have the capacity at the elected legislative level to do that, or even at the elected executive level. You can't do that. You can have people that work in those agencies and departments, and we're fortunate in Georgia to have some very dedicated public servants who work in those administrative agencies, and they try really hard. They deal with some of the more difficult situations because they're face to face with the real people. The ones who make the laws, and then sometimes even the ones who make the regulations,
Yes.
are not face to face with the people who are going to be affected by it. That goes back to what I would tell students about get a job.
Yes.
Learn what the realities are. Find out what the facts really are.
Yes.
Before you start putting rules and regulations on everybody.
What about the relationship between the state government and the federal government? I mean, I think you had some time in Washington. Do you have any thoughts about that? How is that working out, that relationship between those?
Well,
Good, bad, up and down?
I think what's happening is the exact opposite of what our founding fathers intended. Now, I'm teaching a class that looks at the relationship between state government and federal government, teaching it at the University of North Georgia up in Dahlonega. And one of the things that sort of sticks out as I study the original constitutional intent on some of these things, the original founders were very, very afraid of strong federal power. They were especially afraid of the fact that they didn't want a king. And they tried to make sure
Yes.
that executive branch of government was not as powerful as somebody who would usurp it and become a king. And that's why it was so important that George Washington,
Yes.
on his own, decided not to have but 2 terms.
Yes.
We finally had to put that into a constitutional amendment because FDR had 4 terms
Right. Yes,
that he
did.
was elected
Yes.
to.
Yes.
But those kind of things, when you look at it, the founding fathers would be totally shocked if they saw that the federal government was telling the states what to do on everything. In fact, one of the things that the states were so concerned about before they ever ratified the U.S. Constitution was that their powers not be taken away. We've got the 10th Amendment that talks about the reserved powers to the states and to
Yes.
the people.
Yes.
But they viewed the states as much more important than I think the federal government views them today.
Yes.
And it's unfortunate that the federal government can use the power of the public purse
Yes.
to mandate that states do things, not because the states necessarily want to do it, but because if they're going to get the federal money, which is taxpayer money coming from their
Yes.
states and everywhere else, they have to conform to the rules that the federal government sets for them. Our founding fathers did not intend it that way. In fact, they would have been appalled had they known that's what it's developed.
And in just thinking about your time in office, how did that vex your life? I mean, were they?
It convinced me in hindsight that I spent too many years in Washington. I was there for a little over 17 years.
Yes.
And hoping and thinking that I could try to make a difference and get
Yes,
something
yes.
done. In hindsight, I realized I did a few things that were important, but when you have 435 members of the House of Representatives, and trying to get them to agree on anything,
Yes.
even to adjourn, is sometimes tough to do. But I'm afraid now that the partisanship has gotten a whole lot worse in Washington than it was when I was there, and that's not a good thing. We need to come together, and being able to agree in the middle on things is not bad. In fact, that's the way our system is set up. It is somewhat adversarial, but it does give you a way that you can reconcile your differences and still stay in a regulated constitutional environment. And I just hope that we can see a change of that attitude. And part of it is the partisanship has become so vicious.
Yes.
And that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the parties. It is not good for individuals. And hopefully we'll see a time come when people will begin to understand we really need to be nice to each other.
I think so. I mean, and just it just seems we're from the little perch here in Macon, Georgia, just observing the world, with a sense of rancor and I would say hatred.
Yes.
Is terrible. I mean, you don't have this sense of civility that maybe past times did. Is that really? I'm very worried about that. I mean, what can we do to sort of get people on the same team here? Where you can sort of have a different viewpoint, but hating your opponent that's a really bad thing.
Well, I was on the debate team at Mercer when I was a student
good for
here.
you. Yes.
And debate teams teach you to do certain things. One is to be able to analyze facts and be able to articulate your position, because you've got the other side that's taking the opposite view than what you're advocating for. But if you just have to resort to name calling, which you are not allowed to do in a formal debate setting, when you resort to just labels that are catchy labels but they have no significance and no depth to them, and you don't understand what's beneath the surface, that's not a good atmosphere. I always hated it when I got to Congress in particular, and I would hear one of my colleagues get up and speak, and they were handed talking points by their staff. Staff's usually in their 20s, they've been working there in the offices, and they'll hand them these talking points, and they'll start talking. And you soon realize the person that's speaking doesn't know anything about the subject beneath the talking points. And if somebody ever asked them a question that required them to get below the surface on it, they couldn't answer them. And that's where we are today. We like catchy slogans. We like things that catch people's attention. And that's not all the politicians' fault. That's the fact that the public is so tuned out and tuned into things that are not significant in terms of the general public welfare, that the only way you can get their attention is to use these kind of things. And that's unfortunate. We all need to make our attention more focused on things that really matter and approach questions logically. Don't depend on talking heads on television or even on radio to tell you what the issues are or how you should react to the issues. And that's what too many people do. They don't use their own intellect to analyze these things and figure out whether or not this is what you want to do or what the truth is.
Well, we're getting near our little interchange here, but a final question is there anything that you really feel like the country needs to do right now? I mean, you have any big, if I could just give it a wish, what could we do to make America a better place?
Well, I would hope that all of us could come to understand that this country has survived for all of these many years, survived far beyond the normal time frame, which is 200 years of most other major civilizations. That if we're going to be able to continue to survive, we can't be at each other's throats. We can't be a divided country, as Abraham Lincoln said, a nation divided against itself, and that's the way we are now. We are a nation divided against itself, and that's unfortunate. So I hope we'll all put aside any of our rancor. Don't put aside your logic. Don't put aside your principles. Stick to your principles, but be able to enunciate those principles in a way that you can debate with the people who have a different opinion and convince them that you're right, and do so by being nice.
Well, Governor, I'll shake hands with you. It's great having you here.
Thank you.
The world needs people like you. I hope you'll stay out there and play football, so to speak. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Nice to be with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.